Hello there, this is my talk about my trip to Greenland in spring of 2019. My name is Rob, I'm a PhD student at the Scott Polar Research Institute, University of Cambridge, and this was my second trip to Greenland. I'll also be touching slightly on my third trip to Greenland, which was in summer of 2019, but that will come at the end. So let's get to it. These trips involve a lot of prep beforehand. For this trip in 2019, I was going to help Charlie Schoenman, who works looking at seismic effects within the ice, so passively listening to what the ice is doing as the melt season gets going and as ice velocities speed up over summer. So I'm going to look at this expedition because it's a bit shorter. We were on the ice for a week and the whole trip was less than 2 weeks. So compared to the summer trips, it's a little bit shorter, a little bit easier to fit in. So before we go out there, we have a lot of prep to do. This is me in the basement of the Scott Polar Research Institute, and these skis will become important to the story a bit later on. But yeah, we spend a lot of time down here, places like this. You can see all kinds of stuff, like a lot of car batteries for powering equipment. These boxes are ubiquitous in field work. They have a lot of stuff like ice corers, bizarrely like bear traps, even toilet plungers. This room actually hasn't probably been cleared out since the 70s. But yeah, so a lot of prep to get going, and then we fly to Kangerlussuaq. This is Charlie. The previous slide is me, for those of you who haven't yet seen my face. And I kind of wish I'd got a photo outside of the airport. This is like the largest airport in Greenland. This is kind of the waiting area. There's one more room of a similar size. And they sell really nice cakes in Kangerlussuaq Airport. But the airport itself was, I believe, built initially by the American military, who needed somewhere to land big planes. And in Greenland, runways are a big problem because there's a lot of exposed, very hard bedrock. But in this particular location, there is a big outwash plain from the ice sheet, which will just basically swallow up the smaller planes into it, and even the larger planes. So this place is an interesting place. It's got Greenland's longest road, I think 30 kilometers to the coastal settlement of Kangerlussuaq. I believe there wasn't a settlement here prior to the airport, so there is just the American military barracks, a couple of hostels, a hotel, and one apartment block and one set of shops where everyone lives. But yeah, it's a super interesting landscape. And just to center you on where we actually are, I have my textbook. I don't have a printer to print out a good map, but Kangerlussuaq is down here, so we actually get a lot of bushes. I think there's even forests, which is where you might have heard stories about forest fires in Greenland. And that's down here, where the ice sheet really doesn't reach onto the edge. If you drive maybe 10k east from Kangerlussuaq, I think you can get to the ice sheet. You can actually drive onto the ice sheet at that point. But where we were going is up here. So we take smaller planes and eventually a helicopter. So that takes us to Ilulissat, which is really the more touristic town in Greenland. If you want a taste of the Arctic, as it were, this is where people normally come. If you go much further north, things get suddenly a lot more expensive, and the transport links are not so great, which in Greenland typically doesn't mean you're going to be waiting another hour for a bus. It might mean you're going to wait another 2 days for a plane. So if you're trying to fit all that into a 1 or 2 week holiday, it's Ilulissat is normally where people stop, and it's also home to Jakobshavn Isbrae, which is a really remarkably fast flowing glacier with huge icebergs drifting out. So it's not surprising that it's a popular place. And so this is an example of a smaller plain that we're in. This is one of, I think there's 2 harbours at Ilulissat. This is one of them. You can see that the ice is kind of breaking up here already. Where we're going, that is not the case. You can see, I think, probably an oil or a water store here and some houses. And this is a good time to talk about Air Greenland briefly, who you will become very familiar with if you go to Greenland. And this is the transportation company, which I believe is subsidised somewhat by the Danish taxpayer. But they are notoriously... They'll get you where you want to go eventually, but it might be a bit of an adventure. I'm just trying to find I have a photo with a logo on, so I'll get to this one a bit later on, but people joke that the logo is, this is where you want to go, this is where Air Greenland tries to take you, and this is where you end up. But it's always a pleasure. They have really good hard-boiled sweets on their smaller flights, made with Greenlandic herbs, and they're to die for. And they'll put you up wherever if they don't get you there on time. I've always ended up in... Actually, have I? I've never actually been delayed overnight on an Air Greenland flight. But people who have either been put up in a 5-star hotel or in a village hall, which is also the dentist for the local region, so next to a dentist's chair on a roll mat. So you take what you can get. I think with increasing tourism, things like that will become more streamlined. So from the plane, you get a really good glimpse of the Greenland ice sheet itself. You can see that here, just stretching off into the distance, and a lot of snow that is beginning to melt on the mountains here, but has not yet melted entirely, and also some ice clogging up the fjords. This is where we started to notice that it looks like maybe the snow is a bit further back than it should be. You can see that it's maybe a little bit difficult to make out on this particular image, but you can see the snow line. You can see snow here and ice here. And that's a problem for us who had been banking on skis as a mode of transport, because if it's just ice, you can't ski over that. So this is probably an opportune moment to bring in the only graph of this talk, which is Greenland ice sheet surface mass balance for the year that we were there. So we've got the cumulative surface mass balance. So this is how much snow is being accumulated in gigatons over the year, and how much snow and ice is being melted during the melt season. So this black line is the 2018-2019 trip that we were on. 2011, 2012 in green. So generally glaciologists talk about the 2011-2012 year as like an exceptionally high melt year, and it indeed was, as you can see here. But I think it's becoming increasingly common. So 9 out of 10 of the largest melt years on record, so since 1980, have been in the last 13 years. And this is quite terrifying. We generally, especially prior to 1990, would have thought of these ice sheets as responding on a geological time period, not almost. Yeah, you might expect a slight change with increasing CO2, but nothing as dramatic as we've seen. And we've basically seen melt rates just rapidly increase and ice really tank it, which is very alarming, of course, and that's why you've probably heard of the Greenland ice sheet in the news. And I can answer any of the questions that you have on that at the end. So this is in comparison to the 1980 to 2010 average, and our spring trip, you can see, came just as the melt season was getting going. So this means that there's probably still a bit of snow falling, but also melt beginning, and this is obviously the whole ice sheet, whereas we were in quite a specific locality. But what this shows is that there was actually not that much snow falling over winter, and the melt season got off to an early start. So alarmingly, the sea ice was beginning to melt several weeks earlier, and there was no snow for us. This was also a worry for Charlie, because she needed to get to the data and put in new memory cards prior to the melt season kicking off. So it was a bit of a worry for her, but I think it worked out okay in the end. Also, the funny thing with the memory cards is it was actually cheaper for us to fly out and attend to the stations than it was to go for the super flashy seismic model, which costs tens of £1,000s a pop. But the slightly cheaper one have a memory constraint, so that's why we were going out there. Also, just some general servicing of the equipment. Okay. So from this flight, we can see Uummannaq. We actually have to take a further helicopter, so we land a little bit away from Uummannaq. Uummannaq doesn't have a runway. They are building more runways in Greenland. So, for example, in Ilulissat, it was initially funded by the Chinese, but I think they've changed that, so it's now Danish. But that's going to probably bring a lot more tourism to the area if standard, like, what are they called? Like Boeing, like the small passenger planes you might go on, or you may have gone on in the past, with EasyJet. And I think that will really change the character of places like these. So this is the town of Uummannaq, which actually means heart-shaped in Greenlandic, the heart here. To me, it looks a bit like a dragon's back rising out of the sea. You can actually see that in this photo. This is from a helicopter round, and you can also see the sea ice, which was beginning to break up. They had a couple of skidoos go down, which I think happens every year. Once one or two skidoos go through the ice, they're like, okay, we should stop using the ice. So we get a helicopter out. I mean, at this point, it wouldn't have been safe really to go over the sea ice. And that's how, when people are going out of Greenland or to Nuuk or Ilulissat, they'll tend to take the helicopter. But for locals traveling in winter, they'll take huskies across the ice, or they'll just drive across the ice. You can get a taxi on the ice, which just drives over the ice in winter. And in summer, there's boats. But there's this in-between period during the melt season and the freezing season. So, yeah, that's the overview of Umanak, which is the base town that we all became quite familiar with over repeated visits, and it's a really amazing place. You'll see some photos a bit later on that show that there are like shrubs and a few bits and bobs of vegetation clinging to a rock, but by large, it's a very desolate landscape. There is a lake you can see here, which is generally the town's water supply, and this is perhaps a problem. There's a rubbish dump around here where the fire service will periodically burn the trash every few weeks, and those fires can go for quite a long time. And the smoke will generally go in the prevailing wind direction over here and deposit some of the smoke over the water. So we drank it, but I probably wouldn't want to drink it for years. But you can see that the harbour is frozen. We'll see a close-up of that in a bit. You can see the school here. Oil storage for winter and the petrol station down here. If there is a road network, it's common to drive just to get transport things. But the roads don't go very far. It's about as far as you can see. But the petrol will also be used for skidoos and boats. We have the only stone building, which is, I believe, a colonial era church here. And the town centre itself is here with just a few shops. So it's maybe got the population of a village in the UK, but it feels like a town. It's quite a self-sufficient place. There's a hardware store where you don't even have to be Greenlandic to buy a rifle. And food shop, one shop selling clothes, haberdashery, etc. And that's it. And this is kind of the centre for this area. So the place where we got the flight from, the helicopter flight from, also Ikerasak, which you'll see later on, and a few other small settlements dotted around. And for those who are wondering, the main industry is fishing. There's also some mining. It always seems to be a question like how is a country so far out supported? But it's important to remember that the overall population of Greenland is about 50,000 people, which is like the size of a couple of small towns around Cambridge, or less than half the size of Cambridge. But we don't ask in the UK like, oh, what is that town doing to support its industry? So it seems strange to then reflect that onto Greenland. But there's a lot of fishing and resource extraction, which make of that what you will. So we are gratefully put up in unoccupied houses owned by the Umanak Children's Home. So this is me in one of the art centres. About the basement of this, which is about the same size as this room, is full of these clothes for the kids. Seal skin and fur clothes, I think, to reinforce tradition. It is a really amazing place, the children's home. I'll go on to show you some photos and talk a bit more about it. But they're very good. It's run by Anne Andreasen, who comes from a Faroese fishing family. There's a lot of solidarity between these far-flung Atlantic places, even though they have quite different historical lineages. So Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And yeah, you'll also spot a narwhal horn here, just chilling out. Those are very common. It was quite amusing seeing a particularly long one try and be fit into the fuselage of a helicopter. But they're very common decorations. And that's a little sleeping pod up there, which was super nice and cozy. But when there's a lot more of us here, so in summer, here it was just me and Charlie for a few days. We were waiting for Kuhn, the third team member. We'll just be sleeping on mats here. So there's no curtains. It's always light. But thankfully, the work's quite tiring, so you fall asleep okay normally. Yeah, and I actually didn't have on the way out, I lost my phone on the ice, so I didn't have an alarm, and swung by the children's home where they were having a meal, and the helicopter pilot was also there. So I got woken up by the helicopter pilot knocking on the window when I got out. So before we go onto the ice, there's more work. Testing equipment. This is Charlie putting together one of the tents. So we just need to make sure everything is functional. This is obviously important survival equipment. And make sure it's not got any holes, or there's not been any, I don't think you get mice, but maybe flies or something could damage it. And you can see that there's also this exhibition here. So I'll show a few of those in close up in a little bit. This is the shipping container that we have in the outskirts of Umanak. So it's kind of around here, like close to the rubbish dump. In fact, in summer there was a lot of smoke coming like directly onto us while we were working. And few important bits of glaciology equipment. You'll notice the same Zargis boxes that you saw in the basement of Spry. Tents, rope, so that's when we walk across potentially dangerous terrain and we need to be tied together. Sleeping mats here. This big spool is what we use when we drill boreholes in the summer. So it's a long hose that melts the ice vertically down. So these photos are from Kangertitivak, also known as Scoresby Sund, around the year 2000. So the east coast is even more sparsely populated than the west coast. In fact, it's the area around Scoresby Sund. If you go further north, it gets insanely remote. There's just a few old explorer huts, I think, of the main permanent settlement. But it's a really remarkable part of the world. I'd love to go at some point. But these are just photos of the people who live there. And then talking about the children's home a bit more, I don't have any photos of the kids for obvious reasons, but they do, in the children's home, have a lot of music rooms, a lot of photos such as this, reflecting traditional ways of life, and full of art, the most amazing art, and big windows looking out onto beautiful spaces. So I do have some photos of the art, both from Inuit and Danish painters. And the last one. Now, this is of a sunset in Greenland. I don't actually have many good sunset photos in this selection, but the sunsets are amazing. I remember getting off in 2018 off the ice, and when you're on the ice, it's just blue and white, like with a searing intensity. There's no softness of colour, really, unless it's cloudy, and that's generally quite nice. But I do remember waiting for the helicopter to go and collect some more stuff, and just sitting on a rock and staring out of the icebergs and like the endless ocean and the sunset. And it was a really magical moment, especially we still had just got off the helicopter after a month on the ice. Hadn't really been to the house yet, nowhere near having a shower, anything like that. Just staring out at these icebergs drifting off into the distance. So another aspect of Greenland is these dogs. This is like a typical kind of street side view in Umanak, especially on the way towards the containers. And you'll notice quite a lot of like rubbish around, so disused propane canisters, shopping trolley, and this is quite common in this part of Greenland. I don't think there's a centralized waste disposal scheme. As I said, things just get burnt, which I don't know, it's more very open. It's not like they try to hide it. And I do remember a documentary, I think by Channel 4, which was almost felt like it was trying to paint a negative picture of Greenland and its waste, but it was pinning the blame on Denmark, which to me reflects an ignorance in how these countries are managed. Like, Greenland is constitutionally independent. It's responsible for its own rubbish management, which the Danish person said as such. So it's people view Greenland as being dependent on Greenland, but it's on Denmark. But it's constitutionally more similar to the UK and Scotland within the Kingdom of the United Kingdom. But yeah, it is very common. Obviously, this is one island in an otherwise totally untouched wilderness. So this is another shot of the village centre. You can see the big cliffs soaring off in the distance. And yeah, I think this is the main food shop to the left. I actually remember getting off in 2019 in summer, and there was some kids listening to Billie Eilish, which really stuck with me. I hadn't heard music or just seen other people for a long time, and it's like, oh, maybe this song's popular now. Yeah. This is the harbour. You can see the same kind of mountains looming in the distance. And you can also see a lot of fog rising off the sea ice. And this fog is very common in Umanak. And this is the main thing which will prevent you from getting a helicopter in or out. In fact, it's so frequent that you can go to the heliport. You might be there for a very early flight and see what appears to be a quarter of a village, a town, waiting for some rides before being told, oh no, it's cancelled. And no one gets frustrated. No one gets annoyed. It's just like, oh, okay, all right, well, we'll come back tomorrow. That's kind of how it operates. That's also one reason that air travel is so expensive. Yeah, I went to Warsaw after 2019 summer for a break, and our flight was cancelled, and you get people like raging and like, I have to get back. But I was quite chill and looking forwards to my refund or compensation for a late flight, which obviously you do not get in Greenland. Yeah, so you can see more of that fog here, and it only has to be coating the heliport really, and the helicopter just can't land. So we did walk out on the sea ice a bit, but as I said earlier, it was beginning to break up. But it's a cool landscape. You can see the icebergs that have just been frozen in place. And I'll show you a photo of this port in summer a little bit later on towards the end. Sorry, you might be able to hear my housemate having a meeting as well. This is probably sometime towards evening. It was May when we were there, so it was already not really getting dark at night. It's like a permanent dusk, which is so beautiful. In summer, the height of summer, the summer solstice, it just looks like it would be like 3 o'clock on a winter's day, at 3 in the morning. So there's just no respite. I think when the sun did go down in 2019 summer, stayed up and like watched it dip below the horizon and let out a howl. You can see Ikerasak in the distance. That's this peak here. That's the closest village. Actually, I think the other village might be closer, but I'm not sure how far that is. 10k, 20k, and that's on the way to the ice sheet. Is down here. So that's where all these icebergs are coming from. Yeah, so eventually it's time for us to go. Kuhn had arrived, and we took a couple of kids from the children's home out with us. They just had their headphones on for the helicopter journey, totally chill. Got out, kind of looked around, had a cigarette, took a few photos, and then went back. But you'll notice we're in a big helicopter now. I think we were dropping some stuff off for the summer trip. On the way back, we had we had a very small helicopter for how much stuff we had, and had basically stuff stuffed everywhere. But the heli ride is like full on. I still don't know if it lasts an hour or half an hour. It's even more intense when you know you're going out for a month or you're coming back from it. It's probably like amongst the most intense experiences I've had. And here you can see the frozen ice-choked fjords. Looking a bit bleak here with the overcast sky, but we could still fly out. And I think on this particular helicopter ride, my headset was broken, so I had like a really loud beeping noise, and I was like, "Oh shit, we're gonna go down. We're gonna go down." But it was just my headset, not the helicopter. They're very good. I don't go down very often. So yeah, so we made it onto the ice sheet finally. So here you can see Kuhn, who's arrived, and this is the cache that we left in the summer. So food, unused food, etc. Maybe a bit of fuel in there. Fuel cans here. Interestingly, these fuel cans, you can see the valves are horizontal, so that's in case one of them breaks, you're not going to lose all of your fuel. And flags to show you where this is. And it was cold. It was, I think, below -20 with wind chill. Like, we don't get that in the UK. You might get it in the States, but I definitely was not used to that. But if you're feeling cold, you're doing it wrong. One of the people did get Charlie got minor frost nip from dealing with some of the equipment with thin gloves on. But otherwise it was fine. In fact, in the sleeping bags, I got too hot at night. The tents are very warm, even though I think outside it's quite a bit below -20 at night. But yeah, it's a cool place. I think we actually saw some birds out there that had got a bit lost. We normally don't see any life at all, and they flew back inland. Also saw the ice bridge plane, so that's the radar plane that has been monitoring Greenland's surface in lieu of the satellite, which I think has now been launched. But that was cool. It's like a big bellied plane. I think it did a flyby, like, oh look, there's some glaciologists down there. So we have camp set up. This is one of the dusks that I was talking about. You can see a lake in the distance. So these lakes are generally frozen over the top in winter, but they don't freeze solid. Just to be pedantic, that was what my master's thesis was looking at. And you might have heard of those in the news as well, for like speeding up the velocity of the ice temporarily. But yeah, so in this one, you can see the mountains in the distance. And this is quite important. It's like an almost an anchoring of like, there is the land, the terror in the distance. So it's really nice to be able to see that. In summer, we were camped like much closer into the lake in a basin. So if you didn't leave that, all you'd see was ice going up gradually around you on all sides. And it's pretty spooky. It's like being in the bottom of a pan. It's very nice being able to see mountains. I don't know if other people on the team feel that way, but I do. And this is inside the tent. The best kind of food after a long day is freeze-dried with noodles. Chicken tikka. In the tent, it was actually, we had a very, very strong wind for the first 4 days we were out there, which basically stopped us from being able to have a conversation. Also stopped me from being able to sleep. So I didn't really sleep while I was out there. But it was quite a short trip. But yeah, in summer, it's cooking a lot of pasta or rice dishes for up to 12 very hungry glaciologists. This is camp in the morning. You can see me fully togged up. Nice thick gloves. Again, feel pretty fine. It was a new experience for me, but wear very warm clothes and it's not too bad. It's actually more pleasant if it wasn't so windy when it's cold than when it's hovering around the 0 degree mark. That is the absolute worst for weather, because everything gets wet and then the wet seeps into your bones, and yeah, it's really not good. So first began our orienteering, basically going around the geophones to service them. We'd do a few each day, probably walking up to about 20k. Walking, not skiing, To me, it wasn't a problem, but Kuhn was disappointed by the lack of ice. But it did mean I didn't actually have the right boots for this, so I was walking all of this in ski boots, like mountaineering ski boots, which was not the most comfortable experience. But that'll teach me to bring a new pair. So this is like a typical vista. You can see, again, the very bare ice. And here we have Charlie attending to one of these stations with the mountains in the background and the lake. So we're a bit higher up here. And the views are just absolutely amazing. You can see one of the solar panels quite high up. So the melt would probably have been about here when we left it. And then there was a further like meter or so of melt between, so that would have been in August or July, August. So I think we also lowered those down to make them a bit more stable. And sometimes we drill in that pole as well. So yeah, that was our time on the ice, about 5 days. And before we left, we flew inland. So this is above the snow line. This is in the accumulation area. So that's where the snow is falling at a greater rate than it's being removed. And we had to dig out this box to stop it just getting buried forever. So this is recording GPS data and also weather data. And it's a bit like a cottage industry with these boxes. Working out how to get it at the right temperature is difficult. Like, any electrician will tell you, do not put electrics in a black box and just leave it there, because there's no ventilation and it will heat up, especially when the batteries get full from the solar and wind. They stop taking in electricity and it gets discharged through a high resistance resistor, which produces heat. But obviously it's very cold, but then when it gets covered in snow, that acts as an insulator. So not this one, but another one in summer, probably from the wind generators being very effective, burnt out, but didn't explode. Battery fires can be really nasty things, but we think there was just not enough oxygen in the container for the fire to really take hold. So it just melted a few things, but thankfully not the actual data. But that's one of the challenges. The way Bass deals with it is to route the thermistor outside the box so that it discharges into the snow. But this was an exciting experience. The weather actually looks quite good here, and it was clearing up by the time we dug this out. But when we got in here, Starley, our helicopter pilot, was like, it's not good visibility, guys. And it was not good visibility. I looked out the window and I felt sick almost immediately for a long time, because when it's overcast like that, the ice looks like the sky. And Starley was like, if it gets worse, we might need to stay here for a few days. So we were worried about that. But then when we were digging it out and I was like, oh no, Starley was just playing Candy Crush. So that set my mind at ease. If you're ever in a sketchy situation and you want to diffuse it, don't start talking. Just start doing really nonchalant things like playing Candy Crush on the Greenland ice sheet. So then we fly out. This just gives you an idea of like the scale of the crevasses that we fly over. You can see the Greenland ice sheet in the distance. Well, this is the Greenland ice sheet, but just spilling down off the mountains with these great big crevasses. It's really amazing flying over that. And we landed just to service another GPS station on land. That's Kuhn, looking a bit like a penguin. And that's the terminus for Store Glacier, so that's 5 kilometers across. So you could quite easily fit Cambridge in there, and you can we fly over that. We had some cameras set up. This was in summer, set up with solar panels, which we were recording, and that was really, some really cool flights. Like that rock there, I remember, is just huge. It's probably, it's almost as big as El Cap in Yosemite. The scale is vast. This is us in the crammed helicopter on the way back, seeing more of Umanak's Dragonback. You can actually see that the water is open out here, so it clings on longer in the bays. And I think there'd also be a Danish icebreaker coming through here to ease things up. Obviously, they hadn't really had any fresh food delivered since summer. They get the occasional bits of vegetables come in through helicopter, but it's there's not a lot of selection in the shops. So then we're off. That's probably about 4 in the morning. 5 in the morning, I think. And I was the most junior, so Kuhn and Charlie had gone the night before. Charlie had a wedding to get to, so that left me to clean up everything, including the literal shit. But I get to see this. Got woken up by the helicopter pilot. Had a nice meal at the children's home. And probably the deepest 5 hours of sleep of my entire life. And that's just one of the little tractors looking very Wes Anderson-y on the town in between Umanak and Ilulissat, which I've actually forgotten what it's called. So that takes us to the end of the spring trip. I have a few more photos of summer. So this was probably the most stressful 2 weeks of my life. Getting back, actually, maybe with coronavirus it's been outdone, but getting back and having not very long to finalise all of my PhD stuff. So that was this cable, and I quite like from Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote the script for Space Odyssey, is any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and I'm inclined to agree. We use this to look at seismic vibrations within the ice, which travel hundreds of meters down from the force of a hammer, a big hammer swung by a stout man, but a hammer nonetheless. And we also use it to record temperature, so that's what my PhD was on. And that paper's actually just been accepted for publication, so if you're really interested, you can read it. I would recommend. So we measure every meter the temperature with this stuff. It involved a lot of time in labs like this doing stuff. You can see the light coming up there using fusion splices. They're actually called fusion splices, which is pretty mad. Eventually we go back. So this is the port in summer, looking absolutely gorgeous with the boats mulling around in the deep black water. Our container was out here and the rubbish tip is over here. So the main Umanak town is over here. And when we were out in summer, a lot of what we were doing is just borehole drilling. So that's the spool, you'll see. It's crazy seeing that slung underneath a helicopter with diesel pressure washer heaters to send that heat down. So this is probably the midnight shift. These boreholes take 16 hours to drill. You can see some pretty vital Pringles and coffee here too. And it worked. It worked. So much prep went into this, and then also into the post-processing. It was a really mad experience, but that's me looking chuffed as fuck with some solar panels, and this was also going into a DAS, the high-tech space center inside. So this also wouldn't have been possible without the responder team. So that's my supervisor, Paul Christopherson, Bryn Hubbard, Charlie, who was on the other trip. Kuhn didn't come on this trip. Mike, moi, Tom, Sam Doyle, Adam Booth, Mickey Mackay, Sean. Oh God, I can't remember that guy's name. He was only there for a few days. Simon. No, it wasn't Simon. Anyway, he was from Silixa. He helicoptered in for a few days to do the seismic stuff. And Eliza. Yeah, and then the last bit was flying out. So from an architectural landscape point of view, this might be interesting. This is how the millionaires do Greenland. So it's like ultimate glamping. Very beautiful location. These endless icebergs. It's probably Disco Island out there. Solar heated shower, perhaps. But yeah, it was quite mad. Like when we flew out in 2019, the first sign of civilization was a cruise ship in Uminak Fjord. It's a very different experience having to go on holiday there, but I'd love to go on holiday there, don't get me wrong. But you get people doing things like ski the last degree to the North Pole, and all kind of mad pseudo challenges like that. The last photo, which was my phone background for the longest time, is just of a greenhouse in Ilulissat. So nice to see plants and flowers after being somewhere so desolate for so long. Really like an emotional experience. But yeah, that kind of takes us to the end of that talk. So thanks for listening.